Evan Jenkins had never been one to believe in ghosts or things that go bump in the night. He prided himself on being a rational man, a man of science, and a man who had learned to trust his senses over superstition. But the house on Mercer Street had begun to erode his certainty. It wasn't much to look at when he first saw it. A two-story, faded blue structure with peeling paint and a crooked porch. From the outside, it seemed like a place that had been forgotten by time, a relic of some earlier era. It wasn't even in the best part of town, tucked away behind a row of rundown houses, the kind of place people passed by without a second glance. Evan had bought the house on a whim, seeking to escape the chaos of his city life. His job as a software developer had left him feeling drained, and after the death of his father, Evan needed a fresh start. The house was cheap, the perfect project for someone who wanted to be alone. It was supposed to be temporary, just a place to clear his head. But something about it felt wrong from the moment he stepped inside. The first clue came the day he explored the basement. Evan had always been curious, and while the rest of the house was in varying stages of disrepair, the basement was untouched. The door to the cellar had been locked when he arrived, but with a little elbow grease, he managed to open it. A strong, musty smell greeted him, and the air felt cooler down there, as though the basement had been waiting for him to come. The basement was cluttered, filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and tarnished appliances. But what really caught his attention was the far wall, where a large, dark stain seemed to spread across the stone like some kind of shadow. It didn't look natural, and there was something unsettling about how it seemed to move the longer he stared at it. As the weeks passed, Evan began to notice oddities around the house. Items moved when he wasn't looking, and the sounds of footsteps echoed through the halls late at night, even though he was alone. Sometimes he'd hear whispers, just faint murmurs that he couldn't quite make out. At first, he convinced himself it was his mind playing tricks on him. But then came the dreams. In the dead of night, Evan would wake up to the feeling of someone watching him. His heart would race, and his skin would crawl as though invisible eyes were on him, waiting. The dreams always started the same way, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of his room, its features obscured by darkness. The figure never moved, never spoke, but the longer Evan stared, the more he could feel its presence pressing in on him. One evening, after a particularly restless night, Evan made his way to the basement again. He had to know what was causing this unease, this growing sense of dread that was eating at him. He grabbed a flashlight, descended the stairs, and approached the stain on the wall. It had grown larger since he last saw it. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as though something was alive down there, something ancient and malevolent. He reached out to touch the stain, his fingers brushing the cool stone. The moment his skin made contact, the room seemed to shift. The shadows grew longer, and the whispers that had plagued him for weeks now filled his ears, louder and clearer. "Get out," they seemed to say, not in words, but in a voice that echoed through his mind. "You don't belong here." Evan recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. The basement door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. Panic set in as the room seemed to close in on him. He turned to find the figure from his dreams standing in the corner once more, its shape now more defined, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly malice. The basement wasn't just a place of storage. It was a prison. Evan's heart pounded in his chest as the door to the basement groaned in protest, its hinges shaking violently. He struggled against the thick air that pressed against him like a physical force, suffocating him with every breath. His mind raced, but every thought seemed to spiral out of control. He had to escape, but the figure in the corner, the shadow that had once only existed in his dreams, moved. Slowly, deliberately, it began to approach him. He backed away, but his feet felt frozen, as though the very ground beneath him had turned to stone. The air was thick, heavy with a presence that Evan couldn't explain yet felt deep within his bones. The whispers were growing louder, morphing into something far more distinct, more menacing. "Leave now," the voice said, a harsh rasp that scraped against his eardrums, reverberating throughout the cramped basement. "You cannot stay." Evan tried to speak, to demand answers, but no words came. His throat was dry, parched from the anxiety that had built up inside him. He felt as though the basement itself was closing in on him. The walls pressing in, the shadows growing longer, thicker. He could hardly breathe. In that moment, everything seemed to blur together. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch toward him, their edges twisting like living things, their forms bending and folding as though they were made of something other than darkness. The stain on the wall seemed to pulse, its dark, viscous surface shifting like liquid. Evan couldn't look away. There was something magnetic about the stain, something that pulled at his soul, drawing him deeper into its embrace. He reached out again, his hand trembling as it hovered just above the dark patch. The moment his fingertips brushed the stone, a shockwave of ice-cold terror coursed through him, and a vision exploded in his mind. He saw himself, or rather, what seemed like a distorted version of himself, sitting alone in the very same basement. His eyes were wide with fear, his hands trembling, and his face was pale, almost ghostly. In the vision, he was writing frantically on a scrap of paper, his movements erratic, desperate. But what truly terrified him was the figure standing behind him, silent, unmoving, a faceless entity whose presence filled the room with an oppressive weight. Suddenly, the vision changed, and the basement was engulfed in flames. The walls crackled and burned, and the ground beneath Evan's feet gave way, sending him falling into a dark, endless void. His screams echoed in the blackness, the sounds swallowed up by the abyss, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he heard his own voice from the past, begging for release, for the nightmare to end. The vision shattered as suddenly as it had begun, leaving Evan gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat. The basement was silent once more, but the feeling of dread hadn't lifted. It had only deepened, growing like a parasite in his chest. Without thinking, Evan stumbled toward the stairs, his hands trembling as he gripped the railing. He had to get out. He needed to leave. But as he reached the top of the steps, he froze. The basement door was no longer in front of him. Instead, there was a dark hallway stretching into the distance, a hallway he didn't remember. A cold gust of wind blew past him, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of something rotten. He turned, and the hallway behind him stretched further than it should have, the walls flickering like the pages of a worn-out book. The further he looked down the hall, the more it twisted, bending in unnatural ways, the shadows crawling along the walls like living creatures. Evan. A voice whispered his name, soft but insistent. He spun around, but the room was empty, save for the flickering light from the basement stairs. The voice came again, closer this time. Evan. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick with a suffocating weight, and the ground beneath him seemed to pulse with life, as though the house itself was alive, watching him, waiting. The temperature dropped even further, and the shadows in the hallway grew longer, impossibly long. They seemed to reach for him, their fingers stretching across the walls, pulling at the very fabric of reality. Evan's breath came in shallow gasps as he backed away, his body shaking uncontrollably. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The basement wasn't just a place, it was a portal, a threshold to something beyond comprehension, and Evan was standing on its edge. Evan's feet finally obeyed, propelling him backward down the hallway, away from the darkness that seemed to claw at him. The walls of the house stretched impossibly, distorting his sense of space and time. The hallway, once narrow and unassuming, now felt like a never-ending maze. It curved and twisted, leading him deeper into a nightmarish place that no longer resembled the house he had purchased just weeks before. His heart pounded in his chest as he spun around, trying to find his bearings. The dim light from the basement stairs flickered weakly, casting long, strange shadows along the walls. His mind raced. This isn't real. He repeated the mantra over and over, trying to maintain some semblance of control. But with each passing second, the house grew more oppressive, more alive, as though it was feeding on his fear. He turned, and the door at the end of the hallway that had never been there before swung open of its own accord. From the darkness beyond it, a cold wind blew, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay, rotting wood, old paper, and something worse, something foul and unnatural. The air itself seemed to warp around the doorframe, distorting it like a mirage. There was a pull to it, a magnetic force that tugged at his very soul, urging him forward. The whispers from the basement, those faint, maddening voices returned, this time louder, more insistent. "Come," they beckoned. "Come, Evan." He staggered toward the open door, his mind spinning, trying desperately to grasp at some rational explanation. This isn't happening. But it was happening. It was real. As his hand reached for the doorknob, the temperature around him plummeted, and he felt a presence behind him. Something close. Something breathing. Its rancid breath crawling across his skin. He spun around, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there. The house, though, was different. Warped and distorted in a way that defied explanation. He couldn't recognize the layout anymore. It was as though the walls themselves had shifted, rearranging themselves into something alien. The door beckoned again. He had no choice but to open it. Inside, the room was unremarkable, at least at first. It was a small, dimly lit chamber with a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. A worn carpet covered the floor, and there was a single chair in the center of the room. But what struck him wasn't the room itself, but what lay in the far corner. A dark, jagged shape loomed there. Something that hadn't been there before. Something that shouldn't have been there. It was the stain. The stain from the basement wall had somehow followed him, stretching across the floor, up the walls, and consuming the room with its shadowy presence. As he took a step closer, Evan's vision blurred, the edges of reality beginning to fray. His mind screamed in terror, but his body moved forward as if guided by some unseen force. There was a hum in the air now, a low, resonating sound that seemed to vibrate through his bones, rattling him from the inside out. And the whispers were louder now, more distinct. He could hear them clearly, though he wasn't sure if they were spoken aloud or if they were in his mind. "Evan," they crooned, each voice distinct, but all speaking in unison. "It's too late." The floor beneath him gave way, the room plunging downward in a sickening jolt. He barely had time to react as the world around him spun out of control. His body slammed into the floor of what appeared to be a vast cavern, dark, oppressive, and endless. The walls of the room had disappeared, replaced by an immense void that swallowed all light, all hope. The whispers grew louder still, filling his ears, his head, until it felt like they were inside him, clawing at his thoughts, tearing at his sanity. "You cannot leave," the voices whispered, their tone now dripping with malice. "You are ours." His breath caught in his throat. The cavern was impossibly vast, stretching into infinity, the floor slick with moisture, the air thick with rot. And from the depths of the darkness, something began to emerge. Something large, something ancient. Its shape was a blur at first, indistinct, but as it drew closer, Evan could see it clearly. A monstrous, shifting mass of shadow, with tendrils reaching out, stretching toward him, its form shifting and writhing as if it were made of pure darkness. "No," Evan gasped, his voice breaking as he scrambled to his feet. "I won't let you take me." But the creature was already too close, its form engulfing him, consuming his every sense. It was cold, suffocating, and it filled him with an overwhelming sense of despair, a knowledge that there was no escape. The creature's tendrils wrapped around Evan, constricting him, pulling into its dark mass. His body seemed to collapse under the weight of it, his chest tightening, his lungs gasping for air that no longer seemed to exist. His mind raced, struggling to hold on to a single coherent thought, but everything was dissolving into darkness, as if he were sinking into an endless void. His hands reached out, grasping at nothing, trying to break free, but it was like fighting against a wall of pure blackness. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more urgent, and each one seemed to claw at his soul. "You belong here, Evan. You always have." The voices overlapped, merging into a deafening cacophony of dread and hopelessness. He was suffocating, drowning in the very essence of fear, and the more he fought, the more entangled he became in the monstrous, shifting darkness. But then something inside him snapped. A surge of clarity cut through the suffocating terror, and a single thought broke through the chaos. The house is alive. The realization struck him like a thunderclap. The house wasn't just a building, it was something far worse. It was a prison, a living entity that fed off its inhabitants, twisting and warping them into something unrecognizable. And Evan was its next victim. But even as that thought chilled him, a spark of defiance burned within him. "I'm not going to let it take me," he thought fiercely. He wasn't going to succumb to whatever nightmare this house had become. He didn't care how it twisted the world around him, or how the shadows whispered his name. He would not become another part of its eternal hunger. With a force of will he didn't know he possessed, Evan forced himself to focus. He remembered the way the house had felt when he first walked in, the silence, the isolation, the heavy weight in the air that had suffocated him since the moment he set foot in it. But now, it was as if the walls were closing in and something had to give. He didn't know how, but he knew that to survive, he had to confront whatever power this house held over him. His hand shot out and found something solid, something real, not the cold nothingness of the creature's tendrils. It was a wooden beam, jagged and splintered, but sturdy. With every ounce of strength he had left, Evan grasped it tightly and swung it in the direction of the darkness. His breath was ragged, his body trembling with exhaustion, but as the wood made contact with the shadowy form, something inside the creature seemed to recoil, as if the force of the blow had pierced its very core. A blinding flash of light exploded from the point of impact, flooding the cavern and causing the shadows to writhe and scream in agony. The voices that had plagued him for so long, those whispers of despair, faltered, then fell silent. In that moment, Evan felt the oppressive weight lift from his chest and he gasped for air, the world around him returning to clarity. The creature let out a final, bone-chilling roar, its form evaporating into thin air as the light consumed it. And as quickly as it had appeared, the cavern began to dissolve. The walls of the house returned, the hallway stretching out before him, and the basement door stood at the far end, slightly ajar. Evan stood frozen, his legs weak beneath him, but his mind was clear. The house was still there, but it no longer held the same power over him. It had tried to break him, to turn him into another part of its dark web, but he had resisted. He had fought back. He stumbled toward the basement door, but as he reached for the handle, a voice, his own voice, whispered from the shadows behind him. "It's not over," it said. "You may have won this time, but the house never forgets." Evan spun around, but the hallway was empty. There was no shadow, no creature, just the echo of his own words lingering in the air. The house was quiet now, almost too quiet, but Evan knew one thing for certain. The battle wasn't over. Whatever dark force had claimed this place wasn't finished. And as long as he stayed, it would continue to hunger for him, waiting for the moment when he would let his guard down. With a deep breath, Evan stepped through the basement door, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. He would leave. He had to leave before it consumed him completely. But even as he ascended the stairs and reached the front door, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, gnawed at him. As he stepped outside and into the cold night air, he glanced back at the house one last time. It stood there, silent and still, but in the back of his mind, Evan knew that the house was watching him, waiting, always waiting, for the next soul to cross its threshold. And no matter how far he ran, it would always be there, lurking just out of sight, in the shadows. It was the basement that haunted Ellen the most. It wasn't the dark or the damp smell that lingered, nor the old furnace that groaned like a dying animal in the corner. It was the silence that seemed to seep from the very walls, a silence that had once been a comfort, but now felt like an accusation. The house had been in her family for generations, an old Victorian on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by overgrown trees and thick hedges. Ellen had inherited it when her parents passed away, and ever since she had moved back in, something had been off. Her father had always been the one to go down there, to tend to the things she never asked about. The shelves lined with old tools, the crates of dusty books and forgotten trinkets. He would never tell her what he did in that basement, but every time he came back upstairs, his face would be pale, and his hands would tremble. As a child, she never thought much of it, chalking it up to the overactive imagination of a kid. But as an adult, the same fear began to gnaw at her, like an itch she couldn't scratch. Ellen had been avoiding the basement for years. Even after the house was hers, the thought of going down there was enough to make her heart race, her breath come in shallow bursts. It wasn't that she believed in ghosts or anything as simple as that. It was the way the house seemed to watch her. The way the basement felt like a place where something waited. She had almost convinced herself it was all in her head, until tonight. The storm had come out of nowhere, an angry thing that rolled in with the setting sun. The winds howled against the windows, and the trees outside whipped wildly in the gusts. As the power flickered and finally went out, Ellen was left alone with the creeping darkness that filled every corner of her home. A loud crash of thunder rattled the windows, and Ellen jumped, her pulse quickening. She cursed under her breath, her eyes darting toward the basement door, which loomed just at the end of the hallway. It was silly, she knew that. But the basement felt different tonight. The house had settled into its familiar creaks and groans, but there was something else beneath it. Something that didn't belong. Ellen's feet moved on their own, almost as if they were drawn to the door. Her hand hovered over the knob for a long moment before she steeled herself and turned it. The air was thick with the smell of mildew as she descended the steps, the faint flicker of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She could feel the temperature drop with each step. The shadows seemed to deepen, stretching along the walls like dark hands reaching for her. She had been down here before, but tonight felt different. The shadows weren't just shadows, they seemed to move, to breathe. Her skin prickled with unease, and she swallowed hard, pushing forward. "Just get it over with," she muttered under her breath. She could hear her father's voice echo in her mind, telling her not to fear what was down here. But that voice, once so reassuring, now made her feel more alone than ever. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find. Maybe it was the remnants of the past, or maybe it was just her own mind playing tricks. But when she reached the far corner of the basement, her flashlight flickered one last time and then died. The silence that followed was suffocating. A soundless weight pressed in on her from all sides, and for a moment she was paralyzed. She knew she wasn't alone. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain strong. There was no answer, but something shifted in the dark. A subtle movement, just out of sight. It was enough to make Ellen's blood run cold. She had to get out. But as she turned to leave, a soft scraping sound echoed from behind her, the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, dragging itself across the floor. Ellen's heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run. She spun on her heels, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the basement, but there was nothing there. Just the faint glimmer of the flashlight's dying beam, flickering like a warning. The scraping sound stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. For a long moment, Ellen stood frozen, her breath shallow and uneven. "Get a grip," she whispered to herself. "You're just hearing things." But even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't true. The air in the basement had shifted, grown colder, heavier. The silence wasn't empty, it was filled with something. She took a cautious step back toward the stairs, but her foot caught on something. A sudden pain shot through her ankle, and she stumbled forward, slamming her hand against the stone wall for balance. "Damn it," she muttered, wincing as she rubbed the injured spot. The floor was uneven, littered with old furniture and discarded items, remnants of her father's life. But it was something else that had caught her foot. A small wooden box, half buried beneath a pile of old rags. Ellen crouched down and tugged it out, its weight surprisingly heavy for its size. The box was old, the wood darkened with age and worn smooth in places from years of handling. It had a strange, unsettling energy to it, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. There was no name or inscription on the lid, but it felt oddly familiar, like something she had seen before but could never place. Her fingers hovered over the latch, a hesitation rising in her throat. Something inside told her not to open it. But curiosity, that insidious force, won out. Ellen clicked open the latch, the soft sound almost deafening in the thick silence. As the lid creaked open, a rush of air passed over her, cold and stale. Inside, there were old photographs, faded and yellowing with age, but they weren't just any photographs. These were of her family. Her parents, her grandparents, all of them smiling and laughing. But something was wrong. The faces in the photos were distorted, as if someone had taken a sharp object to the paper and scratched out their features. Ellen's pulse quickened as she flipped through the pictures. her breath caught in her throat. But it wasn't just the scratched faces that unnerved her. It was the last photograph, the one at the bottom of the box. It showed a picture of the basement, her basement. But the room was different. The walls were intact, the floor pristine, and the shelves were filled with strange objects she couldn't recognize. But there, standing in the corner, was a figure. A man, his face obscured by shadow, but his posture unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized who it was. The man in the photo was her father. What the hell? Ellen whispered, her mind racing. The picture was decades old, yet her father had never told her about any of this. Why had he never mentioned the basement in his stories? Why had he avoided talking about it altogether? Suddenly a sound broke through her thoughts, a low, guttural growl, like something deep and primal. The noise came from behind her. Ellen's blood ran cold and she slowly turned her head, her breath freezing in her chest. In the far corner of the basement, something moved. It was slow at first, like a figure emerging from the shadows, its outline indistinct, but growing clearer with each passing second. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and as it stepped forward, the light from her dying flashlight caught a glimpse of its face. It was like a mask, hollowed out, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. Its mouth was wide open, a jagged line that stretched far beyond what was humanly possible. It was as if the basement itself had given birth to this thing, its very foundation twisting to create a nightmare made flesh. Ellen's legs buckled beneath her, and she fell backward, scrambling to get away. Her back slammed into the stone wall, the force knocking the wind out of her. She could hear it moving toward her, its footfalls a sickeningly slow rhythm. The shadows seemed to stretch out, reaching for her, pulling her deeper into the dark. "No, please," Ellen gasped, her voice trembling. She fumbled for her flashlight, her fingers slipping in her panic, and then, finally, she managed to twist it on again. The beam cut through the darkness, briefly illuminating the figure before it seemed to recoil, vanishing back into the shadows. She didn't wait. Ellen scrambled to her feet, her ankles screaming in protest, and bolted toward the stairs. Her breath came in desperate gasps as she sprinted up the steps, her hands shaking as she reached for the door. She slammed it shut behind her, her heart hammering in her chest. But even as she leaned against the door, panting and terrified, she could still feel the presence of that thing in the basement, waiting for her to return. Ellen stood against the door, her body trembling uncontrollably. The storm outside had worsened, the wind howling like a pack of wolves, rattling the windows. But inside, all was eerily still, too still. The oppressive quiet weighed on her like a physical presence. She glanced over her shoulder toward the hallway, feeling the shadows creep along the edges of the walls, as though the house itself was watching her. She could still hear the growling from the basement in the back of her mind, a faint echo that seemed to linger in her bones. She had barely made it out, barely escaped. And now, the thought of going back down there was enough to send a wave of nausea through her. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to confront whatever that thing was, whatever had been hiding in the dark for so long. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was so quiet at first, just a tap. But then came another, followed by several more, each one growing louder, more insistent. Ellen froze, her blood running cold. The knocking wasn't coming from the basement, it was coming from the other side of the door she had just locked. "No, no, no, no," she whispered, backing away. She had seen nothing when she'd closed the door. No shadows, no figures, no movement. Yet the knocking continued, as if something or someone was trying to get in. Suddenly, the sound of something scraping against the wood broke through the night. It wasn't a knock anymore. It was something else. Something like claws. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as the sound grew louder, more frantic, like whatever was on the other side was growing impatient, desperate. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound strong. "What do you want?" There was no answer, just the continuous scraping, as if whatever it was trying to tear through the door. Then, a whisper, a voice so low that it barely reached her ears, but it was unmistakable. "Come back." Ellen's breath hitched in her chest, her mind reeling. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was her father's voice. But how? He had died years ago, A heart attack that had taken him suddenly, in the middle of the night, when Ellen had been just a child. She hadn't even been able to say goodbye. How could he be calling to her now? "Please," the voice whispered again, its tone laden with sorrow, desperation. "Come back to me. I'm sorry, so sorry." Her hands trembled as she gripped the door, her mind swirling in confusion. She knew she should leave, run as far away from the house as possible, but she couldn't bring herself to move. The thought of confronting whatever was on the other side, facing the truth of her father's legacy, gnawed at her. She had spent so many years running from the past, ignoring the house's secrets, hiding from the memories she didn't want to face. But this was different. The house was calling her back, forcing her to confront the shadows she had buried deep within. "Please, don't leave me," the voice pleaded, sounding more like a sob now. Ellen's heart clenched as the memory of her father, the man who had always been there for her, flooded her mind. The thought of him alone, trapped in the dark, begging for her help, it was too much to bear. Without thinking, she reached for the door handle. Her fingers brushed the cold metal, and the moment they made contact, she felt a chill run up her spine. The air in the hallway grew heavier, the silence broken only by the whispering voice. It was as if something was waiting just beyond the door, something that needed her to open it. "You have to help me, Ellen. You have to come back. Please." With a trembling hand, Ellen turned the handle and pushed the door open. The basement was still, bathed in the same oppressive darkness as before. Nothing moved. No growls, no figures, just the cold, echoing emptiness that seemed to stretch endlessly. She swallowed hard, taking a hesitant step into the hallway, her eyes fixed on the stairs that led to the basement. But then she heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from below. The scraping sound had returned, but it wasn't from the door anymore. It was coming from the basement, just as it had before, but now it felt different, closer, more urgent. Ellen's heart raced as she realized what was happening. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The house wasn't just haunting her, it was pulling her in. The walls whispered her name, the shadows stretched toward her, and the darkness that had once been comforting now felt like an inescapable trap. Ellen's breath was shallow as she stepped into the dark hallway, her feet moving almost involuntarily toward the basement door. She could feel the weight of the house pressing in on her, the air thick with the scent of must and decay. The house wasn't just old, it was alive, pulsing with something that felt ancient and unyielding. It had been waiting for her, drawing her in like a moth to a flame. The footsteps from below grew louder, closer. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to run, to leave. But she couldn't, not when the voice was still in her head, echoing through the quiet. "Come back to me," it had pleaded. "I'm sorry, so sorry." She had to understand what had happened, what her father had hidden in the darkness of the basement all those years. She had to know what had driven him to the edge. Her legs trembled as she descended the stairs. The basement was suffocatingly cold now, the air thick with an unearthly chill that seeped into her bones. As she stepped onto the basement floor, she could hear the faint scraping again, now joined by a soft whisper, like the rustling of paper in the wind. But it wasn't just the shadows of the past that haunted her. It was something far darker. "Father?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. "Is that you?" The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the oppressive silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, making your ears ring. But then, a low, guttural growl rose from the shadows, deep and rumbling. Ellen's blood ran cold. The growl was closer now, unmistakably so. Something was in the room with her. Something was moving, slowly, deliberately. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, the feeling of being watched almost unbearable. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, her fingers numb with fear. The beam flickered, casting a thin thread of light across the room, illuminating the far corner of the basement. That's when she saw it. The figure. A man. Her father. Ellen gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The man before her was wearing the same old clothes her father used to wear. His brown jacket, his worn boots. But his face, it wasn't her father's face. It was twisted, distorted, the skin drawn tight over the bones, his eyes dark pools of emptiness. He looked like her father, but he wasn't. "Father?" Ellen whispered, her voice breaking. She reached out, her hand trembling as she extended it toward the figure, but the moment her fingers brushed the air, he vanished. For a second, Ellen stood frozen, staring at the empty corner. She felt the ground beneath her shift, as if the room itself was shifting, rearranging. The basement was no longer just a basement. It was a memory, a place where things that had been buried for too long came to the surface. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows closing in tighter, suffocating her. Then she heard it again, the scraping. But this time, it was accompanied by a voice, soft, barely audible, but clear. It was her father's voice, distant but unmistakable. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I never meant for it to happen." The words pierced her, and Ellen felt her knees buckle beneath her. She collapsed to the cold floor, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. The darkness seemed to close in around her, the weight of the house pressing down harder, the air thick with regret. "Tell me what happened," Ellen shouted, her voice raw with desperation. "What did you do?" For a long moment there was only silence. And then, as if the house itself were answering her, a low hum filled the air. It grew louder, vibrating in her bones, until it reached a pitch that was almost unbearable. The shadows around her began to twist and writhe, forming shapes, figures that moved in and out of the darkness, flickering like memories in a nightmare. The walls seemed to pulse, the very foundation of the house groaning as if it were alive. Ellen's heart raced as the truth began to take shape in her mind. Her father hadn't just been hiding something. He had been hiding everything. There had been a reason he had avoided the basement, a reason he had kept it locked. The things that had been buried down there, whatever dark force he had confronted, had never really left. They had been waiting for her. A final, gut-wrenching realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. She wasn't meant to leave. The house, the basement, the shadows, they were all pulling her in, forcing her to face what had been buried for so long. She had never understood the weight of the past, but now she did. She was part of it. She was trapped in it. The scraping sound grew louder, and Ellen could feel it. Feel the thing in the darkness, something ancient, something powerful, moving closer. It wasn't her father. It wasn't a ghost. It was something far worse. Ellen tried to scream, but no sound came out. And in that moment she realized that she had never truly left the basement at all. The shadows swallowed her whole. The old house stood like a silent monument at the end of the street, its decaying structure a testament to years of neglect. The paint peeled from the siding and the windows were dark, their glass coated in grime. To anyone passing by, it seemed abandoned, left to slowly wither in the shadow of time. Yet, for Jennifer Turner, it was the place she had called home for the past decade. It had been years since her parents had passed, and she had inherited the house, finding a sense of solace in the isolation it offered. At least, that's what she told herself. Jennifer's life had settled into a predictable rhythm. She worked from home as a freelance writer, her days spent in the silence of the house, broken only by the hum of her computer. But recently, something had begun to change. It started with small things. Things she brushed off as the normal creaks and groans of an old house. The flickering of the overhead lights, the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the basement late at night, the cold drafts in rooms where there should have been none. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if the house itself was alive, breathing in the darkness, waiting. It was on a cold autumn evening when everything escalated. Jennifer had just finished writing an article about old houses and their history when she felt a sudden urge to go down to the basement. She hadn't been down there in months. The basement, with its stone walls and low ceiling, was a place she usually avoided. It was where her parents had stored old furniture and forgotten boxes, a damp, dark space that seemed to have its own life. The air down there felt heavy, thick, as though it pressed in on her from all sides. "Just a quick look," she muttered to herself, pushing aside the rising unease. She told herself that there was nothing to fear. It was just a basement after all. But as she descended the creaking stairs, the cold air seemed to thicken, the darkness swallowing the light from above. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached the bottom, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. Her gaze fell on the far corner of the basement, where an old wooden door stood slightly ajar. She had never noticed it before. The door was hidden behind a stack of boxes, its wooden frame warped and faded with age. Jennifer's heart raced as she approached the door, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. The faint smell of mildew mixed with something else, something metallic, like rust. She had never seen this door in all her years living in the house. It felt wrong, like an intrusion into something private. "Must be a storage room," she whispered, trying to dismiss the rising sense of dread. But as her hand reached out to touch the handle, the temperature dropped, a sudden chill creeping up her spine. Her fingers hesitated, but something in her gut urged her forward. She turned the handle slowly, the door creaking open with a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Behind the door, the darkness was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light. It felt as if something was being blocked out, something that had been hidden for years, waiting to be uncovered. Jennifer's mind raced. This was absurd. There was nothing in this house that could harm her. Yet, as she stepped into the room, the air thickened, pressing against her chest as though she were descending into the very depths of something ancient and unknown. She fumbled for the light switch on the wall, and when it flickered on, her eyes widened in shock. The room was empty, save for a large, dusty mirror hanging on the far wall. But the mirror was not just a simple reflection. It was something more, something that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. In the dim light, the reflection of the room was distorted, as though the mirror had captured something that didn't belong. Suddenly, Jennifer heard a noise behind her, a soft scraping sound, like nails against wood. She whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest, but the room was still empty. The mirror, however, now reflected a figure standing just behind her, its face hidden in shadow. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure moved closer in the reflection, its presence undeniable. But when she spun around again, there was nothing there. Only the oppressive silence of the basement, wrapping itself around her like a vice. Jennifer stood frozen in place, her heart racing in her chest. The hairs on her arms prickled, a cold sweat beginning to bead on her forehead. The silence around her seemed to thicken, pressing in on her from every direction. She could feel the weight of the mirror's gaze, as if it were watching her, waiting for her to move. The scraping sound, which had seemed so distant a moment ago, now filled her ears, growing louder, closer, until it was all she could hear. It was coming from the dark corners of the room, as though something was shifting just out of sight. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she slowly turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, its outline barely discernible, but its presence undeniable. The reflection was warped, distorted, as though it existed in a space outside of reality. The figure's limbs seemed elongated, twisted, and its face was hidden in shadow, but Jennifer could feel its eyes on her. Cold, hungry, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every instinct in her told her to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot, her body refusing to obey. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to come from within her own mind. "Don't look away," it hissed, the words chilling her to the bone. "You can never look away." Her heart skipped a beat, and she stumbled back, slamming into the wall behind her. The mirror seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, its reflection twisting more violently now. The scraping noise intensified, a sound like nails dragging across stone. She covered her ears, but it didn't help. The noise was inescapable, reverberating in her skull, making her dizzy. What is this?" she gasped, her voice shaking. The figure in the mirror moved closer, its shadowy form stretching toward her. She could feel the cold radiating from it, seeping into her very bones. It was as if the room itself had begun to shift, bending and warping around her. The air grew thick and her chest tightened with each passing second. She had to get out, she had to leave, but when Jennifer turned to the door, she froze. The doorway she had entered through was no longer there. Instead, the walls of the room seemed to close in on her, the narrow space growing smaller and smaller. The mirror's reflection was all she could see, its darkness swallowing her whole. No, she whispered, panic rising in her throat. She backed away, but the room was closing in on her, the edges of the walls blurring as if reality itself was fracturing. She spun around, desperate for escape. But the only thing that existed was the reflection of the figure in the mirror, its distorted shape now looming impossibly large. The figure stepped forward in the reflection, and Jennifer felt the chill of its presence creeping into her skin. Its face remained hidden, but she could feel its gaze, sharp and predatory. It was as if it was feeding on her fear, growing stronger with each passing second. She could hear its breath, heavy and labored, as if it were straining to reach her. And then, without warning, the reflection reached out. Jennifer screamed and stumbled backward, her legs giving out beneath her. She hit the ground with a thud, but the cold did not stop. The mirror was all she could see, the reflection moving in sync with her own frantic motions. She looked down at her hands, but they were trembling violently, as if they were no longer hers. Her own reflection was mocking her, its eyes widening in terror as it mirrored her every movement. The voice in her mind came again, louder this time, echoing through her skull. "You will stay with me," it hissed, the words laced with malice, "forever." The mirror seemed to darken further, the reflection now completely overtaking her. She could feel the pull, the weight of it, like a hand reaching out from the other side. She tried to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't move. She was trapped in the reflection, trapped in the house, trapped in the dark. Her breathing quickened, her chest tightening as she tried to force herself to her feet. She had to escape. She had to get out of the basement. But as her hand reached toward the door that wasn't there, she felt a cold, clammy hand grip her wrist. The cold hand on her wrist felt like ice, sending a jolt of panic through Jennifer's entire body. She tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, its fingers digging into her skin with an unnatural force. The chill from the hand spread up her arm, freezing her in place, paralyzing her with fear. The scraping sound in the darkness grew louder, now joined by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor behind her. She could feel the weight of whatever it was closing in on her, just behind her, its breath hot and damp on the back of her neck. "Let go," Jennifer gasped, her voice weak and trembling, but the hand held firm. She twisted in an effort to break free, but it was as if the very air around her was holding her captive, suffocating her. Every time she tried to move, she felt that same pull, that dark energy trying to drag her back into the mirror, into the reflection. The room, the house, everything seemed to be collapsing in on her, its walls constricting as though the very structure was alive, feeding off her terror. "Please," she begged, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please, I don't want to go." But the grip on her wrist didn't relent. In the reflection of the mirror, she saw herself struggling, her face twisted in fear, but the figure behind her, the one she could feel but not see, was closing in. It was taller than it should have been, its silhouette shifting and warping in unnatural ways. Its features were still hidden, but Jennifer knew it was smiling, a cruel, mocking grin that sent a chill down her spine. The voice returned, the same gravelly whisper, now louder, more insistent. "You belong to me now. You cannot escape." Jennifer's heart thudded painfully in her chest, and in that moment, she understood. The house had been waiting for her to uncover this door, this hidden room, this terrible truth. It had always been there, quietly feeding on the fear of those who dared to enter, slowly twisting the house into something dark and unrecognizable. And now, it had claimed her. There was no escape. Her mind raced, trying to think of something, anything, to break free from this nightmare. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to block out the reflection in the mirror, trying to block out the feeling of the cold hand still gripping her wrist. But it was impossible. The room, the house, the mirror, it all felt suffocating, pressing in on her from every direction. The air was thick with a malevolent presence, and Jennifer could feel it closing in, surrounding her, wrapping itself around her like a vice. "Get out of my head," she screamed, her voice raw and desperate. "Let me go." But the grip only tightened, its coldness seeping deeper into her bones. The dragging sound grew louder, now almost deafening, as if whatever was behind her was mere inches away. She opened her eyes again, her gaze locking with the figure in the mirror. The distorted face of the reflection was now visible, twisted and warped, its features melting in and out of view. It was smiling, that same wicked grin, its eyes empty voids of darkness. The mirror began to crack, small fractures spreading across the glass like spider webs. As the cracks deepened, Jennifer felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. The mirror was breaking. It was coming for her. "No," she whispered, backing away with a frantic look. She had to escape. There had to be a way out. The figure in the reflection moved again, stepping toward her in the same synchronized motion as she did. Her pulse quickened as she realized what was happening. The reflection wasn't just mimicking her, it was becoming her. The figure was replacing her, piece by piece, until there would be nothing left of Jennifer. She reached for the broken doorframe, desperate to find a way out of the collapsing room. Her body felt heavy, as though every movement required an immense effort. She knew she didn't have much time. The reflection was inching closer, its black eyes locked onto hers. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't escape. And then, she heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was a voice, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere deep within the house. Jennifer's heart raced as she turned, the cold hand still gripping her wrist. She looked over her shoulder, expecting to see the figure, but there was nothing. The room was empty, save for the sound that was now unmistakable. It was the sound of something breathing. Something close. Jennifer's blood ran cold as the breathing grew louder, heavier, almost unbearable in its intensity. It wasn't coming from the mirror anymore. It was real, tangible, and it was coming from behind her. She twisted her head, her body still paralyzed with fear, her heart pounding in her chest as if it might burst from the pressure. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but she couldn't. She couldn't move. The cold hand on her wrist held her fast, and the breathing, it was like a presence closing in from all sides. The air grew colder, impossibly cold. Her breath fogged in front of her, and her skin prickled with the icy bite of the dark. The room, which had once been a simple basement, now felt like a mausoleum, a tomb waiting to swallow her whole. The walls seemed to pulse with each breath of the unseen thing behind her, the sound of its approach drawing closer, its exhale coming in ragged, wet gasps. Jennifer's eyes flicked between the distorted mirror and the empty space behind her. She could no longer hear the scraping sound. It was drowned out by the deep, guttural breaths that filled the room. The temperature dropped further, and Jennifer could feel the weight of something pressing down on her, as if the air itself had become thick with malice. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking as she tried to break free from the grasp of whatever had taken hold of her. But the grip only tightened, the ice-cold fingers digging deeper into her skin. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. It felt as though her own body was betraying her, as if some force, some evil, had sunk its claws deep into her soul. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. The figure in the mirror, no longer distorted, no longer a mere reflection. It was real. It was there with her, standing just behind her, its face twisted in a grotesque smile, its eyes wide and empty. It was no longer a reflection of Jennifer. It was her. It had become her, but twisted and contorted in ways that were not human. The breath behind her grew louder, more ragged, now deafening in its proximity. Her entire body trembled with terror as she felt a cold hand, not the one on her wrist, but another, run slowly across her neck. The sensation was wet, as if the thing behind her was breathing down her skin, its fingers icy and slick. Jennifer's stomach churned, and her vision blurred as she tried to tear herself away from the mirror, from the figure, from whatever had taken hold of her. With one final, desperate attempt, she wrenched herself from the cold grip on her wrist, stumbling back. She crashed into the cold stone wall of the basement, gasping for breath. The thing behind her seemed to growl in frustration, its presence almost suffocating. She could feel its rage, its hunger, as it lunged toward her. But when Jennifer opened her eyes again, the basement was no longer the same. The walls had vanished, replaced by an endless black void. The floor beneath her feet was gone, and she was floating in nothingness. The mirror, now shattered into 1,000 pieces, hung suspended in the darkness. The figure that had been in the reflection was gone, vanished, swallowed by the void. But the presence remained, heavy and oppressive, hovering just out of sight. "Get out!" Jennifer gasped, clutching her chest as if she could hold herself together. "Let me out." The void swallowed her cries, and she felt herself sinking, her limbs growing heavy as if she were being pulled into the darkness below. It wasn't the mirror that held her anymore. It wasn't the house. It was something older, deeper. Something that had been waiting in the dark for someone like her to uncover its secret. Jennifer's mind reeled, her thoughts spinning in a frenzy. She had to wake up. She had to find a way out. But the darkness surrounded her, pulling her deeper, its icy fingers tightening around her soul. And then, as her vision blurred and her consciousness flickered, she saw it, just before everything went black. A single word etched into the darkness like a brand. Mine. When Jennifer awoke, she was lying on the cold basement floor, her body trembling violently as she gasped for air. Her heart hammered in her chest, and for a moment, she thought she had escaped. She thought it had all been a nightmare. But when she looked up, the basement was the same. The mirror was gone, the door was still shut, and the oppressive silence of the house hung heavy in the air. And as Jennifer stood, a cold breath touched the back of her neck. The house was waiting.